We've got 45 minutes of fantastic content from someone I've got enormous respect for, from their corporate background and their corporate ability and their knowledge of the sector. Because I don't know about you guys, but commercial is a bit of a new world to me. So please give an enormous round of applause. The rather fantastic, the incredibly knowledgeable Suzi Carter.
Thanks, Dan. Hello. Thank you for having me. So hopefully I'm not too much the graveyard shift, and hopefully you've all got a bit of energy from your coffee, because I'm going to talk to you about how to keep commercial as commercial. Now, commercial to resi is a fantastic strategy. I use it myself. It's definitely crest of a wave. It's definitely first mover advantage at the moment. So absolutely, the content of this is very much complementary to that. But commercial to commercial is a fantastic strategy. You can make a lot of money from it. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, particularly my kind of 10-step blueprint for commercial to commercial. Now, don't worry about making too many notes. At the end, I'm very happy to share the slides. So if there's a link at the end that you can look at the slides. So don't worry too much about that. So a little bit about me. Well, as Dan said, I have got a corporate background for many years. I'm a chartered surveyor. I've been a chartered surveyor for now 27 years, which is a bit terrifying. I started out my career at CBRE, where I managed Regent Street in London, and it was a pretty tatty street in those days, and I kind of worked with the team as a bit of a wet behind the ears graduate to kind of try and manage that to make it the street it is today, actually. I also did offices and industrial. I worked for Kingfisher Group, the retail group, particularly working for B&Q, where I acquired the big stores for them. So we did site acquisitions, planning, et cetera, and then building out their big stores. Did that for 6 years until they basically realized they had too many stores and stopped. And then I went to work for Land Securities. Up until recently, the UK's largest property company. Recently been taken over actually by, as number one by an industrial property company, Segro. And I manage big portfolios of shopping centres and retail parks there, latterly managing about £2.7 billion worth of shopping centres. And I hated it. I hated every second of it. So I gave it up in 2015. I'm now an investor, both for residential and commercial. My strategy for this year and next year is industrial and commercial to resi properties, keeping commercial as commercial and doing some conversions. And I run the Commercial Property Academy, which is pretty much my passion project, mentoring people. It's an online course with weekly mentoring on commercial. So without further ado, I'm going to take you through my 10-step blueprint. So first of all, number one is know your market. Number two, niching. Number three, how to add value. Number four, and this is kind of getting into the nitty-gritty now, kind of how you do it. So commercial to commercial lettings, regears and lease renegotiations, adding additional income, because the more rent you add, the more your property's worth, building reconfiguration and extension, mixed use and combining strategies. Then I'm going to talk to you about some golden rules for kind of keeping commercial as commercial, and your exits. So a lot to get through. So if I don't talk through every bullet point on the slides, just bear with me. As I say, the slides will be available at the end. So first of all, know your market. Obviously, for any type of investing, that's really important. Well, probably the most important thing you need to know. For commercial particularly, every type of commercial is different. The markets are all kind of very distinct. Every local area is different in its particular peculiarities. You want to look at things like the types of property in an area. You know, the supply-demand is absolutely crucial. The values, a gap analysis, walk down, if you're investing in retail, for example, walk down the high street, see who's there, see who's missing. Look at the footfall. You know, is it busy? Is it not busy? You know, what's the socioeconomics of the footfall? You know, is it a wealthy area? Is it poor? You know, can it support retail? Occupiers, what lease terms will they take? You know, what rents will they take? Because there's no point doing deals if you're kind of not going to get the right rents or the right lease terms that you're looking for. Do a planning search, look at local plans. I love looking at local plans. I'm a bit of a geek. But basically, you know, for example, industrial. I love industrial. I'm quite passionate about industrial property. And actually, and not just industrial to resi, you know, industrial for industrial. And a lot of local authorities are kind of putting their local plans together. They're really majoring on residential. And they're not realizing that industrial actually hits so many of the trends over the next probably 20 years in terms of the rise of online, you know, cold storage, self-storage, data storage. That's industrial property, and they're just not allowing for enough. Look at the various portals and check the global trends, what's happening in the global market, and how can that apply to commercial property. So, COVID has given a very specific set of market factors, as has Brexit, rise in logistics, et cetera, et cetera. Deal sourcing, apart from UKPA, of course, then you can walk around the area, look at boards. About 50% of deals through agents are actually done off market. But a lot of deals are done through commercial agents. Look at the online portals. Property Link Estates Gazette is the main one, really, but there's lots of online portals. Direct to vendor, you can kind of narrow down your searches by using Nimbus and Land Insight to target commercial property, or commercial to residential for that matter. Repossessions, I'm anticipating there's going to be more of those, more distressed properties. Auctions, I would say some of the commercial auctions are pretty expensive at the moment, but some of the smaller ones you can still find some decent bargains. Via the council, empty properties. There's actually every local authority advertises their property on their own website, and there's actually a government property portal where you can find government property for sale. You can buy businesses where potentially commercial property is undervalued on balance sheets. And sale and leaseback. Sale and leaseback is where a lot of businesses at the moment, because of COVID, are trying to recapitalize, trying to bolster up their balance sheet. They've got owner-occupied buildings that they're selling off the freehold of the building and they're taking a lease back. So they're still operating their business from there, but somebody else, a commercial property landlord, is coming in to take that. So you can do some sale and leasebacks. So number 2, niching. So I don't think I need to tell you what's been happening recently, quite a lot. But every sector of commercial property has responded differently. So if you take kind of retail versus industrial versus offices versus hotels, they've all had their distinct challenges and opportunities during this period. So it's really important at the moment to niche, absolutely crucial if you're going to be looking at commercial property. Traditionally, the institutionally investments are kind of retail, offices, and industrial. And, there's ancillary ones like hotels, pubs, etc. But, there's some rising trends, some rising niches at the moment. So, health. It's pretty obvious that health at the moment, quite a big deal. I'm not just talking about doctors, I'm talking about, chiropractors, physios, etc. Build to rent. Build to rent is actually quite an immature market. And, in America, it's a much more sophisticated market. Data storage, because of Brexit, all the data storage rooms that were kind of shared with Europe are now onshoring. Big opportunities, but big property as well, I appreciate. EV charging, some massive opportunities going forward in EV charging. If all our petrol stations are going to convert to EV charging centres and it still takes 20 minutes to half an hour to charge up a car, then, what commercial uses could you have around that? You can also put EV charging on your commercial properties to get extra income. It's a massive growing trend. So niching is crucially important. And I've developed a model I call the 4 R's to look at niching. So the first one is research. I think I've probably talked about research. Make sure you know your market, even your sub-markets. Sometimes, not all retail leases are kind of 2 years or 6 months or whatever that the press is saying. There's some locations you can get 10-year leases still. I know because I'm getting them. So do your research into areas. What are the socioeconomics like? All the stuff I've talked about really. What are the tenant requirements? Because ultimately, commercial property is fueled by the requirements of the tenants. You want that supply-demand balance to be absolutely in your favour. Speak to commercial agents about that especially. They'll give you a really good flavour of that. Routes. When I talk about routes, I mean exits. Make sure you've got multiple exits. Make sure that you can get finance for all of your exits. Just make sure that you understand what you can do with that property and what your downside is. And then returns. Pretty obvious. We all want to make money. So make sure you've kind of absolutely calculated all those exits and all those returns. And relationships can assist all of that. Commercial property, residential property is all about relationships. Commercial property is massively about relationships. It's a very small market in the commercial property world, so just make sure you nurture those. Number 3, how to add value. So apologies to those of you that know some of this already, but this is how you calculate commercial valuations. So you've got annual rent divided by yield. And a tenanted property is more often than not worth more than a vacant property. So that's because you've got a lease in place and a tenant paying a rent under that lease. What you're aiming to do is basically increase the annual rent and improve the yield. And basically, when a valuer comes along, it's an art, not a science. They'll come along and give you their view, and it genuinely is a view. There's no kind of hard and fast rule of the value. So you want to be influencing that. And this all risk yield is interesting. It basically does what it says on the tin. It calculates all the risks associated with the property. So we're talking about things like, we'll look at the comparables, or a valuer will look at the comparables and say, right, that shot went for 6% yield or whatever. And then you'll compare it to your subject property. So the valuer will look at the market, the economy, where in the cycle are we? They'll look at the sector, what's happening in the sector. They'll look at the location of the property. There's only 3 things that matter in commercial property, and that's location, location, location. Type, size, configuration of the property. Is it fit for purpose? Is it actually the right size and shape for the tenants that are looking for space in the market? What's a tenant covenant? The tenant covenant is the financial status of the tenants. If there's a lease in place, are they going to be around in 10 years to pay their rent, or are they going to go under? And genuinely at the moment, I couldn't tell you if some of the blue chip tenants are good or bad. You really need to do your due diligence at the moment. Lease length, how secure is the rent? So if it's a 10-year lease, you would think it's more secure than a 6-month rolling lease, as a general rule, depends what the tenant's like. The lease terms, if you've got upward-only rent reviews, etc. How's the rent calculated? Is there any rental growth? Have the rent reviews been implemented? Could you just go in there and implement some backdated rent reviews and get a rental uplift? And then that's everything. So in terms of just a very quick calculation to show you how this works. So say you buy a vacant retail property for £350,000. You let it to a blue chip retailer, as I say. I'm not sure what blue chip retailers are at the moment, so just do your due diligence. For a net rent of £65,000 a year, your yield improves to 5.5%. And obviously, the way you do this is by buying the right property in the right location for the right price. And obviously, that's for another day. If we use our calculation, annual rent divided by yield, so you've got your £65,000 divided by your 5.5% yield, that gives you in the region of 1.2 million. So you can see that massive capital uplift. Bear in mind, you haven't done any works to this property. You've literally just let it on a lease. Now, this might be a slightly binary example, but it just demonstrates kind of how you can get uplift by doing a letting a vacant property. Obviously, you need to make sure that's in the right market. If your yield moves out by 1 to 2%, it might move out to 7% or 8%. And remember, in the crazy commercial world, a high yield is a more secondary property than a low yield. It's just the way it works. I'm happy to answer questions on that at the end. Then you might kind of get an uplift between 800 to 900, or valuation between 8 and 900,000. And then if your lease term shorten, your rent reduces, you get a local tenant perhaps, you might get 45,000 divided by, say, 9% yield, which gives you £500,000. But you're still making a lot of money based on your initial purchase price. So that's how you do it. You want to influence both sides of that equation. Yay! Yay! So how do you do this? Well, commercial to commercial lettings. So a little bit about this. So basically, you can let a vacant property, or you can kind of re-let a property that's tenanted. Class D that Ranjan talked about earlier is a great way to do this, because you used to have to apply for planning for change of use. Now you can do it under permitted development, so that's great. And if you haven't got Class C, and if you want to move it to a use outside of that, you have to change the use, obviously, by getting planning. And basically what you're doing is we're looking at this valuation again. We want a valuation uplift by either getting a better tenant, a better rent, a better yield, or ideally kind of all of the above. And really, it is about buying the right property in the right location. You probably hear me say that quite a few times, but that is kind of what it's all about. You want a better tenant. So say, for example, you've got a local tenant in place and you can get a much better blue chip tenant, then automatically, they'll take pay a decent rent and take a decent lease length, then you should be able to get a valuation uplift for that. And really what you're looking for is income from day one and multiple exits. That is definitely the name of the game. And this is Class E. Ranjan took us through it before, so I'm not going to propose to take you through it, but everything in the kind of taupe colour, the kind of bluey green is Class E. So you can see there's quite a range of uses that you can now change between. So how do you find tenants? That's the name of the game, ultimately. So it's really, it's really common to find tenants through agents. You can appoint an agent to act as your letting agent and kind of give them an instruction, and they should have a great relationship with lots of tenants. Put a board on the property so people can see it. Direct tenant contact with tenants is great for kind of local operators. So, Facebook Marketplace, approaching local tenants, calling them direct, etc., is entirely possible for some types of property. There's a nice website called the Requirement List, which lists requirements in each town and city. It's not totally comprehensive, but it gives you a good start. You can source to order. I really like this strategy. So some of my mentees on my course, they've built really great relationships with some of the food stores. They know what their requirements are, and then they're just going out doing some direct-to-vendor deals to kind of source some of those deals. With an existing tenant, really a bird in the hand is always what it's worth. I'm not sure that's the saying, but bird in the hand is what you want, really. So, if you've got an existing tenant, don't just think, I'm going to get rid of them and re-let it. See whether you can extend the lease, see whether you can work with the existing tenant, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. And, this is just an example of how you can just Google requirements. Google Pets Corner property requirements, and you can see that they've got property requirements across the UK. Then you go out and you look in those towns and cities and see whether you can satisfy their requirements. The next one is, number 5, is regear and lease negotiation. So bear in mind our calculation, annual rent divided by yield. We want to try and influence that and try and improve the rent or the yield. And a lease regear is where you've got an existing tenant in place on an existing lease, and maybe they've got like 1 or 2 years left on the lease when you buy it. It's entirely possible to go in there, talk to the tenant, say, would you like to extend your lease? And because there's less risk, remember our all-risk yield is all about risk, there's less risk, and therefore, if you extend it, get better lease terms, maybe get better rent, your valuation, hopefully, usually will improve. And I would always recommend that you go in and talk to tenants before you buy the property. Go in there, find out how they're trading, find out what their intentions are for the property, and then you're kind of much better equipped to do that. And I had a deal probably about 4 or 5 years ago where I was buying an industrial unit. The tenant had fallen out with the landlord, actually, so the agent who was marketing it said there's no potential to extend the lease. The tenant said they're going. When I went to talk to the tenant, they said, we hate that landlord, but we actually really do want to stay here for another 10 years. And of course, that's like manna from heaven, so fantastic. Didn't happen in the end, unfortunately, but that's another story. So basically, you want to kind of secure some longevity or certainty of income. There's another angle where lease regears might work, and that is when, say you've got a tenant on for example, a retail property, and there's a lot of historical retail leases. They're over kind of upper floors as well as the ground floor. They used to take the whole building under a full repairing, insuring lease. Retailing requirements have changed. They now only need the ground floor, or maybe the ground floor and the basement or whatever. So it's an overhead for them. They're paying business rates on it. They're paying rent. They might want to surrender the lease of the upper floors, hand it back to you, and just consolidate on the ground floor. That is very, very common at the moment, and you can certainly do that by negotiation. Of course, they don't have to do that, but it's something you can do by negotiation, and obviously then you can look at alternative uses on the upper floors. So opportunities exist to restructure leases when there's like a short lease, like I said. Maybe the lease terms are a bit dodgy, using the technical terms, so you might want to kind of speak to agents and get some help with that. There might be a break clause. There might be a 10-year lease with a break clause next year, and you might be able to negotiate with a tenant to remove that, and therefore a valuer will look at it and see it as much less risky. There might be, as I said, the tenant occupies the whole property and they don't use part. And you could very much use this as a niche strategy where, you target shops or properties with very short leases, say maybe up to 2 years. The beauty is, like Ranjan said this morning, is that you get income while you're working up plans. And then you might have the potential to extend leases or surrender upper parts or whatever your strategy is going to be. Make sure, obviously, that you've got multiple exits on that. And I won't go through that one, but that's just more detail on it. So number 6, another way to do this is adding additional income. Remember that the more income, the more rent you have on the property, the higher your value is going to be. So, if you increase the rental by 20%, your value increases by 20%. It's just kind of basic maths. So make sure that this is kind of a bit of foresight, just some top tips. If you're granting leases over the whole, and you think there might be potential maybe for adding a advertising hoarding on a busy highway, on a side elevation or whatever, then maybe carve out that area from the lease so that you can do that in the future. Maybe some kind of the air rights above the property or whatever. So, it's a bit of foresight in terms of how you're doing this. And make sure your solicitor knows about that. So additional income could be advertising hoardings in the grounds of the property or on the side. Obviously, you need a busy you need a blank wall or some space to do that. You also need planning permission for it. Mobile phone masts are not quite as de rigueur as it was maybe 10 years ago, but there's still potential to do that. EV charging on the site. You can do that in your HMOs actually, is put EV charging on it, but you can certainly do it in the kind of car park of your commercial property. The other way of doing it is kind of installing facilities the tenant might want. So, when a tenant comes in, they want to do their fit out. And they'll probably be putting like security alarms in, their specification. If you did that for them, they'd probably pay you a higher rent for it, or at the very least, you'd let the property probably quicker because it's got those facilities in it. Not sure how many of us have got properties where we could put helipads on the top, but that is definitely potential. Give them naming rights of the property to them, air rights. And bear in mind that operators, business tenants, have got one price for their property costs. Their property cost isn't just rent, it's business rates and service charge as well. If you can reduce any one of those, then potentially your rent could go up. So I would recommend to everybody in the room that if you've got a takeover property with business rates, just appeal it straight away. Like all the big commercial landlords, they just appeal their business rates all the time. Every time a new kind of assessment comes out, they just blanket appeal everything. And there's specialists that can do that for you. And it is about buying the right property in the right location. I think I've probably banged that drum enough. Okay, number 7, another way to add value or to kind of make money from commercial property is building reconfiguration or extension. Now, bear in mind, we're at number 7. This is the first time I've mentioned physical works. And that is a really important thing about commercial property. You don't have to do physical works, but sometimes you might need to, or you might want to. You might want to increase the attractiveness of the asset to the market, to a particular tenant. As I say, you might want to increase the rent by making it more fitted than it might have been. If it's more attractive to the market, it'll attract more tenants, higher rent, better lease terms, etc. So, you can use permitted development to do this, but you don't have to. So I've just given you an example, retail and restaurants. There's loads of different examples for industrial or offices, but things you can do to improve the property. So retailers are very sensitive about something called the frontage to depth. They like a really nice configuration of unit, not too wide, not too deep. If you could improve the shape, maybe put a residential unit at the back under permitted development and actually make more of a square box, more people might take it. If you surrender the upper floors, take those back, it's actually going to help a retailer at the end of the day because they might actually want to consolidate their business model. You could improve the servicing to the asset. You could refurbish it for them, do a fit out, a new shop front, improve the access, add some parking in, maybe buy some parking down the road that they can park in. If it's a restaurant, you might, they want to get rid of the nasty smells from their restaurant, maybe from their kitchen. Maybe get better ventilation, better extraction, buy the unit next door, split the unit up, all kind of those kind of things to just make the property more attractive, get more rent and a better yield. But what you won't do is you won't do any of this on spec, generally, unless you're absolutely sure that this is what the market wants. So what you would do is you need to do your market research or speak to commercial agents or speak to tenants direct, find out what they're looking for. and then you would do the works. And you'd sign something called an agreement to lease with a tenant, ideally, which would basically be an agreement for you to do some works or for them to do something, but generally for the landlord to do some works, which then you would go in and do the works, and then they would take a lease. And it basically de-risks the works you're doing to the property. That's on a new letting. Get some agents' advice. This is when commercial agents can be really useful for you. And you can look to develop other uses adjacent, if there's spare space, etc. If you're developing or if you're changing an asset, it's always best to pre-let the property. As I say, just try not to do it on spec. You can really come a cropper, and I've seen that many, many times across my career. Okay, number 8 is mixed use and combining strategies. So obviously what we don't do as property investors and developers, we don't just do, we can just do one strategy, but more often than not, we need to have like a playbook that we can go to. So this, hopefully what this presentation does is kind of open your eyes to some other options that you can use for commercial property. And very often what we end up doing is actually mixing strategies, combining strategies. So conversion to residential can be combined with commercial uses, but it's all horses for courses. And as I say, it's very much about multiple exits, making sure that you can combine some of these strategies in your multiple exits. And not all locations are appropriate for commercial to residential. So this is kind of what Ranjan was talking about this morning, so I won't dwell on it too much. But when you value a retail unit, for example, the highest value use is at the front, and that's called Zone A. So hopefully you can see that. Yeah, you can, okay. And the first 20 feet of any retail unit is worth 100% of value. And then the next 20 feet is worth 50% of that, which is Zone B. The next 20 feet, which is Zone C, is worth 25% of that, and kind of so it goes. And the upper parts are worth, you maybe get Zone A divided by 8 or by 16 or by 32. So basically, that's why the upper parts of retail aren't as valuable, because they're usually used for storage or ancillary uses. But it's the front of a retail unit that really is the most valuable. And of course, that's where our permitted development comes in, our conversion to residential. And the wonderful Class A, MA that came in on the 1st of August, which really is a kind of first mover advantage, as Ranjan said. And I've got some details there, but I'm not going to go into it because this isn't a commercial to residential talk. If you've got tenants in situ and you want to do some conversion works on the rest of the property, whether that's doing an airspace conversion or you want to do a conversion upstairs, into flats, etc. And you've got a tenant occupying under a lease, is it a full repairing, insuring lease? What can you do under that existing lease? There's something called quiet enjoyment in commercial leases, which means that you shouldn't really disturb them too much. So you'll need to kind of think about that with your solicitor. And foresight is always really important with these things as well. You should negotiate with them early on in the process. Noise and disruption is key. You might actually want to try and move them on. Sometimes it's just not worth doing some of this stuff with a commercial tenant in place. Having said that, a bird in the hand is sometimes good. So to keep the commercial tenant there. I wouldn't recommend this as a first gambit, but you may sometimes need to pay them to do what you want to do. You may need to change their lease. You might need to give them something like refurbished common parts or a new roof or just something out of it. Definitely use a good commercial lawyer for this and perhaps an agent. And if you want to do airspace, obviously you're going to need to look at kind of rerouting services on the roof, etc. So all this just you need to think about this. If you've got any future plans for this kind of stuff when you buy a property and you're putting a new lease in place, just make sure you talk to your solicitor about some of this stuff. So a bit of foresight. And unless you want them to, check your tenant won't leave as a result of some of the works you're doing. And just an example of kind of multiple strategies at play on a property. This is a case study one of my mentees is doing at the moment that I've kind of mentored her through, which is a lovely deal for her. So she's blocked out the tenant. That's why it's all a bit kind of blanked out, because she's not quite done the deal yet. But basically, it's a ground floor takeaway, But they have a lease, like I said earlier, they have a lease over the whole block, so it's kind of 3 floors above and the ground floor. They've got a lease, a full repairing, insuring lease over there. Very short lease length remaining. They want to remain, they want to renew their lease. They've got dilapidations, which you can claim for at the end of a lease as well, which is always quite nice. If a tenant has taken a full repairing insuring lease, then they need to hand it back in the same condition as it was when they took it. So there's something called dilapidations. She's realised, so basically she did direct to vendor letters. This came through that. She then went to meet the vendor. She got some great rapport with them, met them a couple of times, all the textbook stuff that Rob and Simon were talking about this morning. And she got a lockout agreement for 6 weeks to be able to work up an offer with him. And during that period, because she had a lockout, she had a bit of confidence that probably he wasn't going to be punting it around. So she kind of got a valuation done. She got a build around. She did condition survey, etc. So she basically got all the information she needed to do so she could put an offer out. She put an offer out. It did get chipped up a bit. Sorry, not chipped. It got rejected, and she paid a little bit more, but she was still well within her boundaries. She's now negotiated with the downstairs tenant. They have said that they will surrender the upper parts. They will consolidate on the ground floor. They will take a 5-year lease, so she's got them in the bag, and they will also move out while she does the works because she needs to create a staircase as well. So they'll also do that, and she's got to pay them a little bit of compensation for that. And she's going to apply. It's in a conservation area, but she's going to put a mansard roof on the property so she can get 3 flats out of this. And all in all, her kind of proposed profit is in the region of about £300,000. She's buying it for 220. So that just gives you some kind of flavour how you could combine these strategies. She's still keeping the commercial tenant, but she's kind of doing her upper parts conversions. This should say 2022, but just as relevant for 2021. So just some strategies for you that you may or may not want to think about for 2022. So sale and leaseback, as I said to you earlier, is where you basically you buy a property and the incumbent occupier takes a lease back. The beauty of that is that you have got a tenant in place already, but you do tend to pay a bit more for it. And generally that type of deal is more on the more expensive side, I would say, but it's definitely something because of COVID that a lot of businesses are doing. If you go on some of the main portals, you can see these deals every day of the week. I mean, there's so many of them, or certainly kind of in my area there is. You can pre-let or acquire to order. As I said, it's all about having the right tenant in place on the right lease terms. So if you actually find the tenant first and then find the property to fit them, then obviously, I mean, there's never any guarantees with tenants. And believe me, I've kind of dealt with commercial tenants for 20-odd years, and there's never any guarantees. But if you build up a good enough relationship, you know what their requirements are, and you acquire to order, it can be a nice way to de-risk a property purchase. You can do some asset management, some lease regears, like I said before, lease extensions, surrenders, etc. That I talked about earlier. You can do some development, some permitted development. I won't go into that, but we've talked about a lot. And there's a huge, obviously in England only, there's a huge range of permitted development rights that you can take advantage of now. It really is a bit of a playground for that at the moment. Everyone's getting nothing in the bank, pretty much. So to work with investors at the moment, the finance market is loosening off a bit in commercial, but it did tighten up during COVID. Some of the loan to values reduced, some of the kind of percentage loan rates went up. So to work with SaaS investors or investors is actually really attractive at the moment, cash purchases, etc. And distressed purchases. There's a lot of landlords out there where the tenants haven't paid their rent for quite some time. There's obviously been insolvencies as a result of COVID, and there are distressed purchases in the market. So that's definitely something to, and of course that's what UKPA kind of target through the direct to vendor as well. Some golden rules. So there's just 5 golden rules here. I'm sure there's more if I thought about some, but these are really the key ones. So multiple exits, I've probably been banging on about this enough. Always make sure that you have your multiple exits for your commercial strategies. That could include some conversion to residential strategies, but just make sure that you've got all those costed out. Income from day one, if you possibly can, get income from day one, and therefore, look at potentially exchange delay completion, look at options, etc. As was said earlier, commercial agents will not get offended if you suggest some of these things because it's being done in the commercial world for years and years. So it's very, very common to be kind of creative with your strategies in the commercial world. Always, 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 if there's an incumbent tenant in the property, always speak to them first. As I said to you earlier, find out how they're trading, find out what their intentions are for the property, and if you really can, try, say they've got a 2-year lease length left, you say to them, well, actually, I'm buying the property, how about we agree now what your terms would be for a longer lease length? Then you end up, you might buy that property on exchange delay completion or an option. You've actually then get your tenant's lease extension exchanged before you buy it, before you complete on it, and you've actually, for your finance, you've actually got a nailed-on exit for your, for your finance because you've improved the value from day one. So it's not just about doing works, it's not just about getting PD, you can actually get lease extensions in place as well. If you're doing this properly, you don't always have to do this, but if you've got different options, to obtain valuations pre-purchase for each exit, especially if you get if you speak to your broker and find out who the main kind of lenders would be for your particular strategy, and then maybe even approach those valuers to see kind of how they would approach the valuations, and then just make sure that you can get some valuations done. The other great use for valuations, if you are doing direct to vendor or, well, especially direct to vendor, but also with agents sometimes, is to get a valuation done that you kind of slap in front of them and just say, well, look, I've had it valued at this. Now, you need to weigh this up, obviously, because valuations can be expensive. So, if something's generally on the open market, you probably wouldn't do this. But if you're direct to vendor, this might be something you might want to consider. And consider using commercial agents. Commercial agents are a very different, as Randa said earlier, it's a very different beast than residential agents. And they very often do act for purchasers as well as sellers. Especially if you're doing your first one or, you're kind of doing your first letting or whatever, then they can be very, very helpful. So, consider, definitely build relationships with them, but also consider using them as well. So, number 10, finance and revaluation. So this kind of carries on the theme I've just been talking about, really. So find out, speak to your commercial broker, pre-purchase to find out who the most likely lenders are to finance your particular property or asset management or whatever you're doing. Find out their criteria for lending, and then you've got the potential to change the deal. So, will they the type of property or the type of asset management you want to do, will they finance it? You might want to change the deal, like, split the titles, between the ground floor and the upper parts or whatever it might be, but it just kind of helps you to kind of form your views. Be aware of the lender's valuation criteria, especially at the moment. Some lenders are instructing their valuers to value on vacant possession. So even if you've got some of this asset management uplift, you might not be able to recognise it in your valuation. So just make sure that you check that out. Ensure you're able to finance your multiple exits, because we can't always do plan A, we might have to do B, C, etc. And lenders will relax their criteria. Consider using cash. Consider cash and investors, and just have your multiple exits ready for that. So that is a whistle-stop tour through commercial property and my 10-step blueprint. And it really was a whistle-stop tour. So you need to know your market. You make sure that you niche. Niching really is where the competitive advantage is in commercial property at the moment. So, whether that's a location or a type of strategy, a sub-market, it could even be a row of shops, a small row of local shops on a high street. Make sure you know your market so you know where you can niche. Understand how you can add value through valuation, and then the strategy you can use, commercial to commercial lettings, regear and lease negotiation, adding additional income, because obviously the higher the rent is, the higher the valuation will be, and reconfiguration extension, physical works. And of course, what we tend to do is we combine these strategies with our kind of conversion to residential, our permitted development strategies, etc. Went through the golden rules and we looked at the exits. So I really hope that was useful. If you would like a copy of the slides, it's very techy, not very me at all, but if you would like to scan that QR code, I'd be delighted. You can download those automatically from my website, so please get your phone out now if you would like a copy of the slides. If not, you can contact me on those contact addresses, or you can check out the Commercial Property Academy and on my brand new Suzi Carter website, which is also very exciting, out last week. So that was me. Hopefully that was really useful. I would really encourage you to look at commercial property and look at combining commercial strategies in with your kind of commercial to resi strategies. So thank you very much.